Hello everyone, today as always I'm going to spoil you with a selection of scary stories. Subscribe to the channel not to miss news stories. Enjoy listening. First story. Tunnels. I once knew a man who was afraid of nothing. No monstrosity man-made nor fictitious could subdue his spirits, and the mere mention of the word supernatural would elicit a most cynical example of laughter. This bravery was both his greatest strength and his most profound weakness, for ignorance and heedlessness can often be mistaken for a deep and foolhardy sense of courage. He was to learn the limits of his bravery down in those oppressive tunnels, deep below the streets of Amsterdam. His name was Henki, due mainly to his Finnish ancestry on his father's side, and although his parents had passed away at an early age, it was clear that he believed his courageous convictions could be attributed to his father's character. I had met Henki 4 years earlier while traveling with some friends on a rather common rites of passage, backpacking through Europe during a university break. He and a few of his friends were on a similar trip and happened to be staying at the same youth hostel as myself and my companions in Rome. We all got on well, but both Henki and I struck up an immediate rapport with one another as he was a keen musician and I was at the time still filled with the self-promise, or should I say delusion, of stardom through my own musical pursuits. This friendship continued onwards and we maintained it via email, swapping musical discoveries, talking about politics, and generally getting to know one another as best two people can through simple correspondence. I grew to enjoy our friendly debates over the years and on a few occasions we even visited one another. Henki moved around a lot and as such it gave me a good excuse to visit a number of mainland European countries, not to mention that he always knew which local pubs served the best beer and which restaurants were to be best avoided. Last year I visited Henki in Amsterdam. The Dutch city seemed to be a good fit for him as he always liked to live in the liveliest of places, and with countless meandering canals, bridges, and walkways swamped with millions of tourists every year, Amsterdam, for Henki, felt like the very embodiment of life and vibrancy. At the time he had been recently hired to carry out some important maintenance work on the Rijksmuseum, which is one of Amsterdam's most impressive buildings, and this seemed to have rooted him to the one place for longer than was usual. When I met him in a small darkened corner of a local pub, well away from the burgeoning tourist trade, I was shocked at his appearance. Here was a friend I had grown to know as being larger than life, exuding bravado, and yet I was presented with a shell of a man, slight in stature and racked with self-doubt. He proceeded to impart on me the circumstances which resulted in his precarious condition, of which I will relay to you now. Henki had been working as a civil engineer for some time and relished the challenge of renovating and maintaining the Rijksmuseum, a building with such a long and compelling history. The museum houses Amsterdam's finest collection of historical relics, and being given access to some of its more hidden places which are inaccessible to the general public, piqued Henki's fascination for the obscured and unique. He had been hired most specifically to lead a maintenance crew which had been assigned to assess and repair the building's foundations. This oldest part of the structure dated back centuries and had a most bizarre and, it must be said, quite horrific history. The Rijksmuseum itself had been constructed in 1885, but what it had been built upon possessed a much older and interesting history. In the bowels of the building, under its marble floors and deep red brickwork, lay a labyrinth of abandoned tunnels which at one time served as part of the old city's sewer network. They had long been disused and fallen into disrepair, but they were nonetheless an essential part of the building's foundations and had to be assessed and repaired, otherwise the entire structure would be in danger of subsiding. The ground and upper levels of the museum were beautiful and displayed many wonderful historical relics from all over the world. So welcoming and warm was the atmosphere of the building that it was difficult to imagine the darkness which festered below. After some quick words with the building manager, Henki proceeded to an old, seldom used room at the back of the museum which housed a rather antiquated, creaking, and cage-like elevator which was being used to access the lower levels and sewers underneath. Pulling on a pair of dirt-covered yellow overalls, complete with hard hat and headlamp, Hankey entered the elevator for his first descent. On his trip downwards towards the abandoned sewers, Hankey thought to himself that those of a nervous disposition may let such a dank and isolated place prey on their minds. This may have explained why the previous man in charge of the repairs had left so abruptly, citing nervous exhaustion and refusing to ever so much as set foot in those pitch-black corridors of cold stone ever again. The elevator winch and engine stuttered as it lowered Hankey down 4 levels into the basement. With each passing floor he observed a slight dimming of the lights, and each subterranean level appeared more sparse and stone-like than the one before. A rusted plate attached to the elevator betrayed its age. It struck Hankey that the year of its construction, 1932, must have been amongst the last periods of maintenance carried out there before the persecution of the Jewish people and the outbreak of war in Europe. Hankey knew much of the shameful history of the region as he was part Jewish and his great-grandfather had died during the Holocaust. Many had fled to Amsterdam for sanctuary from the Nazi regime in the early 1930s, but the long blighting arm of Hitler's horrific final solution eventually reached the borders of Holland, sweeping many thousands away to those shameful and barbaric concentration camps. The elevator shuddered to a halt, and after forcing the rusted sliding door aside, Hankey disembarked. The tunnels comprising Amsterdam's disused sewer network were curious in construction and steeped in a history which stretched back much farther into the distant past than that of the museum itself. Having spoken to his employers, Hankey had been specifically told to pay heed to the assessment and repair crew's knowledge of the tunnel layout, as the place could be disorientating and as the lighting system required to illuminate repair work had not been fully installed yet, that he would find it all too easy to get lost. Most importantly, Hankey was informed that the two-way radios normally used to communicate between team members had been playing up, and that they were very unreliable due to interference, probably produced by nearby metallic deposits in the ground. This meant that communication between his team members would have to be carried out verbally, or by using the light from their torches to convey simple messages via Morse code. This was particularly useful in the longer tunnels. In any case, it struck Hankey that the catacombs below really were isolated, lonely places. Care must be taken. Hankey was greeted by Jones, his second in command. Jones was a substantially stout fellow and was rather humorous in nature. He debriefed Hankey on the current progress being made by his new team, informing him that the initial mapping and assessments of the tunnels had gone well. All in all, there were 16 four-man crews, each of which would be assigned a section of the sewers to repair. Hankey would supervise 2 of the crews which were working in one of the more isolated tunnels. After walking for 15 minutes, Hankey arrived at the area which would be his workplace for the next few months. The sound of occasional drilling could be heard in the distance as the workers continued to install the still non-operational lighting system. As Hankey's men would be working further away from the other crews, it seemed logical, although not desirable, that they would have a lighting system installed last. Each passageway seemed oddly shaped, with no 2 tunnels being quite alike. This entire section of the sewer was in fact so antiquated that it had been built long before the careful planning of such constructions had become commonplace. One tunnel would arch onwards for over several hundred meters in a strange semicircle, while others bisected it at right angles, carrying on in a regimented straight line into the darkness. Hankey even found a passageway which seemed to dip and rise only to slither its way along in an unnatural S-shape. Some tunnels seemed to go on forever, others stopped abruptly as if the original builders had been unable to complete their work, leaving in a hurry. Jones tried to keep the conversation light, and with his experience of walking through the tunnels for the past 2 months, Hankey was glad to have a guide to show him the way. Waiting in a large alcove were 4 of Hankey's team. They would work this section of the tunnels during the day, while the other shift would take over later, working through the night. Jones introduced each of them. They seemed nice enough, but Hankey was surprised to find the men largely in the grips of silence. In his experience, humor was normally found in abundance, with repair crews using it to slice through the monotony of working in such cramped and repetitive conditions. Here, though, he found them uttering not one word. Sitting in silence in that imposing alcove, removed from any consideration of camaraderie or fellowship, the only inference that they were not a collection of subterranean statues was the occasional movement of their headlamps altering the shadows around them. They seemed wholly disconnected from, not just each other, but the very environment in which they worked. Haenke brushed this feeling of unease aside and committed himself to cultivating conversation. If these men were in some way angry or uncomfortable with one another, then Haenke would soon lay that to rest. A happy workforce is a productive one. The first order of business was to survey this section of tunnels and decide where repairs were most pressing. Preliminary assessments had already been made, but Haenke liked to evaluate any repair project he was involved in from the ground up. Haenke walked the catacombs with his team and noticed immediately that they were still on edge, that they seemed frightened in an almost childlike way. No amount of questions, casual or otherwise, could elicit anything other than one-word broken replies. As they toured the numerous tunnels, lighting their way with the small torches attached to their safety helmets and taking notes about failing walls, water damage, and estimations of any possible repair time, Haenke pressed the men on their obvious sense of fear, asking why such an experienced crew, who no doubt had worked in many tunnels before, were so apprehensive of mere bricks and mortar. They avoided the questions, looking nervously at one another and changing the topic of conversation with monotone lethargy whenever it veered towards their experiences of the old sewers, or of their previous boss's unceremonious departure from the job. It began to dawn on Haenke that the men's verbal and physical awkwardness was not the result of tensions between workers, but rather of a deep-seated and worrying apprehension of what he did not know. What was clear was that his team seemed to be counting down the minutes until their shift ended, when they could finally clamber out of the darkness into the safety of the world above. As the beam from his headlamp trickled over the damp and crumbling brickwork of the tunnels, Haenke again conceded to himself that some may find such a setting unnerving, but not him. Whatever had caused such trepidation and disquiet amongst the men working down there was surely a simple case of idle superstition, mischief-making, and the quite understandable psychological toll of working in a dark, cramped, and forgotten part of the world. Even Jones, who had through most of the catacombs been jovial and talkative, now adopted the same sullen expression and seriousness of disposition as the others. The passages wound and meandered their way through the ground, long steady trajectories intermittently and abruptly interrupted by sharp blind corners which made it difficult for Haenke to identify exactly where they were. There were so many winding corridors that Haenke felt slightly disorientated and was ready to joke with his men that if they didn't like him as a boss that they could probably leave him there, and he would never find his way out. But his men were no longer with him. He was standing at the mouth of a tunnel, and while he had continued onwards talking, trying to fill in the difficult silences, his men had stopped at the last junction. They stood motionless some 20 feet behind, staring at Haenke with blank expressions occasionally betrayed by the slightest flicker of a very real and gripping emotion beneath, a look of suppressed terror. When he asked why the men were not following, they whispered in reply that where they stood was where the last of the repair work was needed. Pulling out a map and perusing it intently by the light of his headlamp, Haenke surmised that he must have wandered into the most remote part of the sewer network, at the back of the catacombs. And while the tunnels continued into the foreboding distance, this must have marked the boundary of the Rijksmuseum's foundations. What confused him was that where he stood had been marked for repair. He was standing at the entrance to what appeared to be a rather innocuous tunnel, but on the wall next to the opening Haenke could clearly see that someone had placed an identification plaque there, marking it for repair. It read Tunnel 72F, water damage failing brickwork. After double-checking his map, it was clear to Haenke that Tunnel 72F was indeed still under the Rijksmuseum foundations and had to be appraised and repaired. But when he told his men this, they simply informed him that where they stood was as far as they would go. Anger began to take over. accompanied by frustration that the team he was supposed to be supervising were being so difficult. But even raising his voice and demanding that they head into the tunnel did not seem to move them. Just as things became heated and Hinky began demanding that the men do as he say, Jones interjected, "We've worked down here for 2 months, Hinky. This is a good, hard-working, talented crew you have. They will do exactly as you ask, when you ask it, but you will have to accept that for them, and me, our work stops at this junction and that none of us will go near Tunnel 72F. Whether you want to believe it or not, there is something in there." Taking a deep breath and calming himself, Hinky explained to his men that he understood the stress induced by working in such an environment for an extended period of time, but that repairs in that tunnel had to be carried out. He would talk to them later about it, but for now he would carry out the survey himself. As Hinky stepped over the threshold and into the apparently forbidden tunnel, Jones and the other men protested vehemently, shouting on Hinky to leave the passageway immediately. But he saw this as foolish. He was not to be swayed by unsubstantiated, superstitious nonsense. There was nothing in this tunnel to fear, and once more Hinky would prove to others that they should not be so scared, by stepping up, being a man, and pushing forward into places others who are more timid in nature fear to tread. It was a point of pride for Hinky. He believed in always being bold. While the tunnel seemed fairly common in its construction at first glance, as Hinky progressed deeper into the darkness it was apparent that this was unlike any sewer he had seen before. The ground was uneven, the floor dipped and rose much like some of the other tunnels, but what was peculiar was how fractured the surface felt under his feet. The ground was obscured by a thick, almost oily water which in places reached up as high as his knees. He trudged through the stagnant water slowly, not because he was scared, but simply to ensure he had a sound footing. One thing was apparent: however long the water had lay there, it was long enough to fester and produce an unpleasant, rotten stench. The walls were of a different, much older composition than most of the brickwork he had seen in the sewers elsewhere. Whatever the material was which had been used, it was hundreds of years old and was obviously failing, with long penetrating cracks scarring the surface of the increasingly unstable walls and ceiling. The light from Hinky's headlamp was enough to illuminate much of the tunnel, but as he ventured further towards what he thought was a dead end, he realized that the passageway was narrowing and that the tunnel itself did not stop there, but rather tapered slightly before curving abruptly into a blind corner. Hinky estimated that he was around 80 feet into the sewer, and while his curiosity for what could be beyond that corner urged him to move forward, he believed he had made his point to his men, and would now ask them to abandon their fears and enter the tunnel with him. He unholstered the black hand-held radio which all the workers had been issued with from his side, and began requesting for Jones and the others to meet him at the corner of the tunnel. No one responded, and nothing but a quiet buzz could be heard from the radio speaker. Of course Hinky now remembered that he had been warned about how unreliable the radios could be, but just as he was about to turn and shout on his men, something caught his eye. Surely not. There was nothing in this old tunnel but stagnant water and himself. But pushing relentlessly against Hinky's bravado and self-assured disposition was the creeping reality that something was standing at the end of the tunnel. Obscured by the turn, Hinky could only see a glimpse of it, but it was unmistakable. A ragged piece of cloth poked out from around the corner, and although Hinky's mind was unwilling to accept it, the cloth was obviously part of a sleeve which contained an arm, of whose or what's he did not know. Disbelief. Stubbornness can be an effective tonic for even the most horrifying and unbelievable of situations. Hinky's belief in himself and his long history of triumphs over adversity welled up inside of him, filling his chest with pride, and with a strong, confident stride Hinky marched towards whatever was behind that corner. The slush and slosh of the black water echoed throughout the tunnel as he made his way to that blind turn. Apprehension now turned to sadness and empathy, for standing there, shivering and disheveled, was a girl who could not have seen more than 13 years. Her face and hands were blackened with grime and dirt, hiding her pale and malnourished frame. A ripped shirt was all that she wore, hanging from her loosely with much of her body exposed to the cold of that dank, isolated place. Gazing at him between strands of dark matted hair, Hinkie was struck by how beautiful the young girl was, and how afraid she must have been. At first he believed that somehow she must have made her way into the sewers and lost her way, but no matter how softly he asked her, she would not answer, appearing afraid and nervous. Hinkie tried his radio again, but was greeted with the same meaningless static. Regardless, he had to get her out of that tunnel, back through the sewers and into the Rijksmuseum and seen by a doctor. He did not want to shout on his men, as it may have added to the girl's disquiet, so he decided to lead her out of the passage himself. As he approached, Hinkie spoke gently to the girl, explaining that he would take her up above to safety. She seemed terrified of him, and this made Hinkie feel uncomfortable, as he prided himself on being someone who would do anything to protect the vulnerable, and not at all someone to be feared. She made no sound, but as Hinkie neared she raised her hand, pointing one finger at the light on his helmet. He suddenly realized that the light must have been frightening her somehow, so he merely took the lamp off and held it in his hand, the torch now illuminating the girl's shirt more starkly. The changed angle of light brought something unsettling to Hinkie's attention. Pinned to the shirt was a yellow cloth star. It surprised him, as it was entirely familiar, but it took a moment for his mind to grasp the memory. It was exactly like the yellow stars forced upon the Jewish populations during their persecution, to allow non-Jews and members of the Nazi regime to identify them. Hinkie's mind fought against the ramifications of such a discovery. After a momentary pause, he once again was resolute, disregarding the cloth star and asserting to himself that he must take this poor girl out of such horrible surroundings. A tremendous sense of sadness overcame Hinkie as he grew closer. The torch flickered unusually in his hand as he looked down at the girl, her face momentarily illuminated by the shifting light. As he prepared to carry her out of the sewers if need be. But this sense of duty, this compulsion to be brave and assertive in even the darkest of places, was now replaced with something which Hinkie had never felt before. Up his spine and from the very pit of his stomach fear gripped him, terror took him, and a horror so potent made him feel anxious, weak, and unsteady. For Hinkie had not noticed something so subtle, yet essential to his predicament. The girl had not stopped pointing at him as he drew closer. Her arm was ridged and her finger remained outstretched. Even the light which was now in his hands seemed entirely unimportant to her. Realization swept over him like a plague of abject dread. The girl was not pointing at the light, she was pointing behind him. Hinkie did not remember much more of what happened in that tunnel, but he knew that he had indeed turned to face whatever was standing there. He thanked God, not something he was normally inclined to do, that Jones and those men who feared that dark hollow so acutely had dispensed with this fear and ran into the passageway as soon as they heard his screams. Hinkie regained his composure back at the alcove where he had met the men, but he immediately pleaded with them that they take him back out of the tunnels, which is what they did. Once back in the elevator room of the Rijksmuseum, the men sat and had a frank discussion with Hinkie about what had been happening down there over the past few months. Jones explained that the first survey team which had encountered that specific sewer passageway resigned from their posts after just one night down there. A week later, one of their coworkers who decided to stay on committed suicide after complaining to everyone that he could hear whispers coming from that tunnel while he worked nearby. Not long after that, Jones' previous supervisor had seen someone standing at the mouth of Tunnel 72F and had followed them inside. One of the cleanup crews found him crawling out of the sewer on his hands and knees, crying hysterically like a child. He had been heavily medicated ever since, but no one knew exactly what he had seen down there. He would not talk of it. But the men who recovered him claimed he was repeating one word over and over frantically: Nazi. Hinkie was a nervous wreck after his experience, and ordered that no one go into Tunnel 72F. He continued to work down in the sewers, day after day in the dark, but he was consumed by the notion that he had seen something so frightening that he had forced himself to forget. Over the next few weeks he lost weight, and had trouble sleeping, often waking up in a disturbed state, drenched in a cold sweat, unable to recall what he had been dreaming about. The very idea that brave Henke could be reduced to this, that he could be affected so deeply by something he could not even remember in its entirety, preyed on his pride and his sense of self-worth. He first tried to combat this feeling of helplessness by increasing his knowledge of the tunnels. Knowledge, as they say, is power, and Henke felt that if he knew more about that place in the dark, that he would somehow be less afraid of it. He read about the history of the museum, and while he found very little of it helpful, one local legend struck a chord with him. It was rumored that during the Second World War a number of Jewish families took refuge in the tunnels below the Rijksmuseum. When two SS officers were tipped off as to their whereabouts, they entered the tunnels with some local volunteers, hoping to arrest them down there and most probably send them off to a concentration camp. The rumors were that the families ambushed the SS officers and their Nazi sympathizers, killing them and dumping the bodies somewhere in the sewers. This was the story Henke related to me. It was sad to see him so shaken and vulnerable, a strong, powerful individual who had never shown so much as a hint of fear for, or of, anything, to be reduced to a diminished man living on his nerves. Unfortunately, the story does not end there. Some men are haunted both by what they have seen and by what they cannot understand. Ego can be a terrible burden on anyone. Once it is fractured or damaged, the lasting effects can be devastating. Henke could not let go of his pride, nor his desire to feel strong again. Whole. He had never been afraid of anything before, and no matter what was in that tunnel, no matter how much I attempted to dissuade him, he was determined to confront it and reclaim his self-worth. 3 days later, Henke's body was found at the mouth of Tunnel 72F, stuffed into an old duffel bag. It was a heart attack which had killed him, but whoever broke, twisted, and shoved his body into that morbid sack after he died was never caught. I should mention that the bag was of particular interest to the police in case it could reveal something about Henke's death. It was traced to Germany, Army issue to be precise, and hadn't been manufactured since 1941. The end. Thanks for listening. The next story. The Melancholy of Herbert Solomon. On several occasions my interest in the supernatural has taken me to some of the most prestigious seats of learning in the entire United Kingdom. From the venerable halls of Oxford and Cambridge, to the more humble surroundings of inner-city colleges and schools, my pursuit of evidence to substantiate such claims has rarely been fruitful. However, while exploring the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, I found a rather interesting tome hidden away in a dark and musty corner of the campus library. The book itself was unusual, its cover bound in a weathered and blackened leather which unashamedly wore the wrinkles and cracks of time. It dated back to the 16th century, and seemed to contain various descriptions and accounts of the daily lives of the people of Ettrick, a small isolated town built in the south moorlands of the country. Perusing the volume, there were a variety of entries from a number of authors spanning a 60-year period. It seemed to have been handed down from town elder to town elder over that time, and to be quite frank, most of it contained idle musings on the townsfolk and plans for a number of humble building projects and improvements. Just as I was about to conclude that the book was of little interest to me, I noticed on the inside of the back cover that someone had drawn a picture. It was elegantly depicted, but I would never have described it as a pleasing sight. In fact, my immediate reaction was one of disgust upon first viewing it. The combination of the harsh, almost angry black lines used and the stark imagery of the scene as relayed by the artist left me with a thoroughly unpleasant impression of its subject. I shuddered as I cast my eye over it in an attempt to take in the picture of what seemed to be of a man, tall with long, thin arms and legs. His face was partially obscured by one of his gaunt white hands, but what could be seen was monstrous. Prominent veins protruded from his forehead leading up to a pallid bald head. His eyes were deep set into his skull, and the surrounding woods seemed to twist and lean away from him fearfully. At first I assumed that the picture was some form of hideous graffiti, but at the bottom of the page was inscribed the date of 1578, and a rather unusual name, Herbert Solomon. Whether this was the name of the menacing figure in the drawing or of the artist, I did not know. Disturbed yet compelled by that dark woodland scene, I decided that the book required further study. I desired greatly to know who this creature was, and why someone had felt the need to capture his strange form in a drawing at the back of a book otherwise used to record the lives of the townsfolk. On closer inspection, what surprised me further was that the same image seemed to recur elsewhere in the book, but drawn by apparently different individuals. Within the book I found numerous mentions of Herbert Solomon, and it became clear quickly that he was indeed the emaciated man in the picture. He had lived in the 16th century on the outskirts of Ettrick Town. It was a small and underdeveloped place, surrounded on all sides by the thick cover of Ettrick Forest, which itself sat in the midst of a vast region of southern moorland. The town had a small parish church with one humble steeple, an inn normally used by those traveling through the unforgiving countryside, and quaint cobbled streets which wound their way around the stone cottages and town hall, according to the descriptions in the book. During the December of 1577, children began to disappear from the town. The first was a young girl by the name of Alana Sutherland. She had been playing with some friends by an old well on the outskirts of the town, but had dropped a small toy doll down it accidentally, which had caused her much distress. Unable to retrieve it, she returned home to borrow some string and an old hook in the hopes of being able to fish the doll out of the water below. She was last seen walking towards the well just as the sun set. In a panic, the townsfolk searched. They dredged the well, they combed the wheat fields, and even sent several groups of those willing into the surrounding woods. Alas, the girl was not found. A few days later, a young boy by the name of Eric Kennedy was running an errand for his grandmother. It was dark, but he had only to take some wool over to the Monroe place as way of a thanks for the grain they had provided, and they lived but only a few streets away. It was assumed that at least the center of the town would be safe, but the boy never completed his errand. He vanished, as if he were torn from existence. By the end of January, an unusually bitter winter had caused significant damage to the town and its people. Large, thick sheets of ice and snow covered each house and building. Several people died from the cold alone, and the general mood of Ettrick Town was a somber one. Despite these trying times, the townspeople were more concerned with the safety of their offspring. In total, 7 children had now disappeared without rhyme or reason. Whole families wept in despair, and the people of Ettrick began to view one another suspiciously. They knew the truth: someone was taking their children from them. By mid-February, 2 more had went missing, and accusatory glances were now being shared between every family and every member of the community. The town elder decided to act, and took upon himself the arduous task of identifying and catching the fiend. Bureaucratic discussions were had, church groups convened, and in every house, in every street, in every corner of Ettrick, one name crossed the lips of its inhabitants: Herbert Solomon. The more the name was mentioned, the more certain his guilt became. Herbert Solomon was an outsider. He lived in a small wooden cabin amongst the woods which surrounded the town, and due to his unfortunate appearance tended to avoid human contact. What his malady was, no one was sure, and in the unenlightened times of 16th century Scotland, many believed that he was cursed. Modern eyes would have guessed him to be the victim of a wasting disease. He rarely ventured into town, except on a few occasions to trade for supplies, and even in those instances he covered his face with a brown tarnished hat and a gray piece of cloth, which obscured his features below 2 deep-set and darkened eyes. Several of the townsfolk told stories of Herbert Solomon. According to these accounts, he would stand on the edge of the forest watching the farmers till their land, and their children play in the fields. It was his fascination with children which left many feeling uneasy. Some of the town's children returned home from playing near the woods on a number of occasions with beautifully crafted dolls and toys. They were a present from Herbert Solomon, and being innocent children they could not know of the dangers therein. When the children began to disappear, eyes immediately turned to the strange man living in the woods. Accusations were carried by the whispers of fearful parents, and as the whispers increased in number so did their volume, until it was decided that Herbert Solomon must be stopped. On a cold February night the elders of the town decreed that Solomon should be arrested immediately. Grief, anger, resentment, and fear grew to a fever pitch with this news, and every man, woman, and child set out across the fields, entering into the surrounding forest in search of the child killer Herbert Solomon. Details of exactly what occurred that night are limited, but it seems as though the people of Edrictown attempted to remove Herbert from his small cabin by setting it on fire. The crowds cheered as the heat grew and the fire rose. His screams echoed throughout the woods, finally to be silenced by the flames. The townsfolk believed that justice had been done, and while the grief of the parents whom had lost their children could never be quenched, there was at least the satisfaction of knowing that the man responsible was now dead. However, over the following few days an unease descended upon the entire town. Stories began to spread of strange encounters in the streets at night, a gaunt shadowy figure prowling the cobbled stones, hiding in the darkness. Within a week numerous residents claimed to have woken up during the night to the petrifying sight of an unwelcome visitor. One account was of an elderly lady who woke to the sound of something rustling under her bed, only to nearly die of shock as a tall, thin man pulled himself out from underneath. She fainted, but not before she saw his face, a withered complexion as if ravaged by disease, his eyes blacker than night, and his hands comprised of tightly pulled skin over a bony interior. Another story consisted of a local tradesman who, while investigating a noise from his cellar, was confronted by a hideous figure, so tall and gaunt that it had to hunch over to avoid the low ceiling entirely, its sheet-white face flickering in the candlelight. The man managed to escape, but he refused to re-enter his premises. It became clear to the townspeople that the vengeful ghost of Herbert Solomon was still searching for other victims from beyond the grave. His hate and hideous form haunting the town which murdered him. With each passing day the sightings grew in intensity and number. A fog descended on the town, and the people wept and grieved as the sound of Herbert Solomon terrorized each person, night by night. He was seen wandering amongst the wheatfields, in the cellars and lofts of cottage houses, his long gaping footsteps ringing out each night through the streets of Edrictown. They had been cursed. In life Herbert Solomon had taken and murdered their children, and now in death he seemed to possess the twisted means to terrorize the entire town. Then the unthinkable happened. Another child went missing. A young orphan girl who often wandered the streets when she could not find a place to call home for the night was heard screaming for her life. The townsfolk rushed to their windows, looking out but not daring to leave the imaginary safety of their houses, paralyzed by fear. The screaming ceased quickly, and moments later, wandering aimlessly out of the fog, came the menacing figure of Herbert Solomon. He rushed down the street, his lifeless arms bashing against the houses which he passed, scraping the doors and windows with his rigid fingers, emitting an unnatural yell of anger and hatred on his way. The girl was gone, and the town grieved once more. In the preceding days the fog grew denser, and with it came the unwelcome news of 2 more children taken. One a girl whom, after having a raging argument with her family, left the house never to be seen again. The other a boy named Matthew, the son of a notable drunk, who was taken from his own bed by the hands of Solomon, while the father lay unconscious from drink. During a church service the unthinkable happened. Solomon appeared briefly in the aisles of the church, seemingly unaffected by consecrated ground. The congregation whimpered in horror and disdain as his warped, spindly form walked slowly behind a pillar and then vanished. It was indeed a show of influence. Hope was almost lost. Not even a place of worship could deny him, and he was now capable of entering any home at night and then taking whatever or whoever he wished. The town had to act. or abandon the place altogether, but there was no guarantee that the curse of Solomon would not follow. The local vicar, a man by the name of Mackenzie, was asked by the people of Ettrick to use any sacred power which was ordained to him. In an attempt to destroy or banish the spirit of Solomon, a plan was provided. The vicar and a few chosen individuals armed with torches, swords which had been blessed, and vials of holy water, would take guard over the town, waiting for the cursed figure of that child killer to show his face once more. Then they would confront him. Observing as much of the town as possible from several house windows, roofs, and strategic street corners, Mackenzie's chosen waited. They did not, however, need to wait long. That night the lonely figure of Herbert Solomon appeared through the mist, walking the streets of Ettrick with purpose. Yells and screams rang out as people alerted one another that Solomon had returned. Families held their children close as dark thoughts consumed the town. "Please spare my child, take another's." Mackenzie was the first to confront him. His will was shaken by the sight of Solomon's hideous pallid face, rotten and ravaged. The gangly, spindling figure stood staring intently at the vicar through black, clouded eyes. Another man now joined, then another. Before long Herbert Solomon was surrounded. Mackenzie instructed the men to slowly close the circle, drawing their swords with one hand while brandishing flaming torches with the other. Fear gripped them, but they knew that this could be their only chance. Mackenzie threw a vial at Solomon's lumbering feet, and as he uttered a Christian psalm, another man struck out with his torch. The blow crackled as the cloth-covered arm of Solomon caught fire. Cheers rang out from the townsfolk watching from their homes above, but the man had strayed too close, providing a gap in the circle which Solomon claimed with purpose. He fled. His spindling legs and flailing arms cast spider-like shadows on the walls and cobbled streets as he passed. The townsfolk gave chase, following the pathetic figure as it negotiated each street corner, lane, and courtyard in an attempt to escape their rage. The noise alerted the town. Herbert Solomon is trying to flee. From every home across the town, people poured out of their houses carrying whatever they could as way of a makeshift weapon. They flooded the streets and ran towards the protestations, shouts and screams of Solomon's pursuers. With every turn of a cobbled street corner, Solomon was running out of places to hide. Finally, as he stumbled down the town's main street, he stopped. The townsfolk had blocked all escape routes. He was trapped. Mackenzie pushed his way to the front of the crowd, asking for quiet and calm as he approached the hunched, defeated figure of Herbert Solomon. He and his chosen few were going to rid the town of Ettrick of this abomination once and for all. Vial in hand, accompanied by several large, bullish men brandishing swords, Mackenzie approached slowly, reciting verses from the Bible. Through dark eyes Herbert Solomon observed the townsfolk, their faces etched with hate and thoughts of revenge, moving towards him, and then he simply turned and entered an open doorway next to him. The people gasped, and Mackenzie and his followers rushed inside after him. The house they had entered was still, and lying on the hard wooden floor of the main hallway was the pale body of a young girl. The creaking of floorboards under weight sounded above as numerous pursuers searched the house, disappointed to find nothing. Then something miraculous occurred. The little girl gasped for air. She was alive. She had little or no strength. All she could do was utter one word: below. In the cellar of the house Mackenzie found a grim and horrific scene. The floor was covered in blood, and the quite dead body of a man lay face down upon it. Chained to the walls of that dim place were the children who had been taken. They were partially drugged, malnourished, and traumatized, but they were alive. The town rejoiced with the news. Families were reunited, lives were mended. The mist of a bleak and horrible winter slowly lifted, and all seemed well. On regaining their strength, the children recounted what had befallen them. Each of them had been taken by a man called Tom Sutherland. He was the father of the first girl who had went missing, and it appeared that it was he whom had killed her. No one knew for sure, but many were aware of his bad temper, and on more than one occasion he had beaten poor Alana. Consumed by guilt and loss, Sutherland began taking children at knife point and locking them in his cellar, often drugging them with a local herb and occasionally beating them while pathetically weeping in self-pity. On the day that the children were found, Sutherland entered the cellar drunk, carrying a knife and rope. He began striking the children once more, and told them that one would die that day. He untied one of the children and pinned her to the ground with his knees. The knife hovered over her neck, but just as he was about to plunge the blade into her, someone entered the house. Sutherland grew ferocious with anger, but whoever was standing at the top of the staircase struck such fear into him that he quickly backpedaled into the cellar. Ducking under the doorway was the tall, scarred figure of Herbert Solomon. At the sight of him, and now being free, the little girl crawled quickly between Herbert's long legs. She was free, but too weak to run. She fainted before she could escape the house. Details of what happened to Tom Sutherland were muddied by the unstable, semi-conscious condition of the witnesses. But it was clear that his neck was broken, his head twisted with such force that it faced an unnatural, opposite direction. There were various accounts of subsequent glimpses of Herbert Solomon, and some of the children claimed to find beautifully crafted dolls and toys on occasion sitting at the edge of the woods. But of course this cannot be substantiated. Indeed, I would have said that the entire story could not be substantiated if it were not for the events which I experienced several months after reading that old book, in the depths of St. Andrews University. A colleague and dear friend of mine invited me to stay at his family home for a few days in the countryside. I knew that the house was in the borders, not half an hour's drive from Ettrick, and could not miss the chance to have a closer look at the area. I had managed to persuade the powers that be to allow me to take the book from St. Andrews and show it to my friend. He had a particular interest, and not insignificant knowledge of the history of the area. I thought perhaps he could shine a light on this curious tale. His family were very kind to me, and the house and its grounds were serene in the summer sun, with his children playing in the fields having a carefree and happy time. After reading the book he told me that it was fascinating, and that he knew of a local poem which had been written in the 17th century about a man called Solomon who killed children. But he could not tell me any more. The next day we heard screams coming from nearby the house. It was my friend's little girl. We raced outside, following the cries for help over an old fence and down a steep grassy hill. We reached a winding and furious river. The girl had fallen in and was clinging to a large tree root which thrust out from the opposite embankment into the water. The root was wet, and my friend let out a scream of anguish as his daughter lost her grip, being swept downstream towards a large formation of huge sharp rocks which jutted out from beneath the surface. The river would not let go and was throwing her around with such force that it was difficult to see how she could survive. Filled with the abject terror that she could drown, we finally made it to the water's edge. As we rushed into the murky torrent, we watched helplessly as the poor little girl was about to crash into the rocks. We were too far away. Suddenly our attention was grabbed by the cracks and creaks of a tall, gaunt figure at the other side of the river, rushing out of the woods at tremendous speed on the opposite bank. With one swift motion a thin, bony hand plunged into the violent water, prevailing against the immense currents, finally pulling the young girl to safety. She was alive. Frightened, crying, but alive and unhurt, the pale-faced, emaciated figure placed the girl gently on the ground, stared at us from across the water through darkened eyes as we ourselves clambered to safety, then turned and disappeared into the woods, fading away to nothing but a memory. Even in death Herbert Solomon was the kindest and gentlest of souls. The END. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel.